Welcome to episode 14 of the Welding Codex. This is a podcast for those that want to learn more about the technical side of welding. Welding codes, heat treatment, welding defects, metallurgy, and all the subjects your high school welding instructor didn't have time to cover. In this episode, welding engineers and CWIs Peter Kinney and Garry Pace continue their review of AWS D1.1, Structural Welding Code Steel. This episode covers Clause 6, Part A, General Requirements, Part B, Contractor Responsibilities, and we will start in on Part C, Acceptance Criteria. Clause 6 is Inspection. This is a cornerstone of the AWS D1.1 Structural Steel Code, and as such, it has a lot of material to cover, so it'll take Pete and I a few episodes to cover the material. Anyhow, thanks for joining us. Note, Pete and Garry bounce back and forth between code editions 2015 and 2020 during the course of this episode, so we apologize beforehand if the podcast gets a little off track. Before going on, time for the advertisements. If you're on a budget and are looking for an affordable online training course for the AWS Certified Welding Inspector exam, visit train-eng.com. Train-eng.com. Like TRAIN -ENG.com, and check out the online courses for Part A, General Knowledge, and Part B, Hands-on Inspection. Train-ENG.com also has some buffet-style options on the CWI review course. If you only want to take one or two chapters in that online course, we got it set up like that. That's an option. They also have a CWI question bonanza. So if you're pretty solid with the material and you just want to do practice questions, the CWI question bonanza might be the avenue you're looking for. If you like what we're doing here, feel free to make a PayPal donation on my website, texasweldingengineering.com. Also check out my YouTube channel. The material posted on that platform has been there for quite a while, but kind of similar but different. Anyways, welcome to the Welding Codex. Welcome to the Welding Codex with Peter Kinney and Garry Pace, welding engineers. This episode, we're going to start through the brutal slog that is going to be Clause 6 inspection or Clause 8 in 2020 inspection. So we're going to grind through this one and, beat this dead horse like we always do. Strap in and enjoy. Okay, so Part A, we got general requirements. 6.1, the scope. Clause 6 contains all of the requirements for the inspector's qualifications and responsibilities, acceptance criteria for discontinuities, and procedures for NDE. Okay, Pete, you were talking off the air with me earlier, 6.1.1. You want to run with that one?
Sure. So this one, whenever you're bidding a job or you're making up the contract for bidders to bid on, anything besides visual has to be stipulated. The only thing required by this code is visual. All welds have to be inspected. So if you want certain welds to be mag particle tested or PT tested, or we need the UT or RT, all the full pen welds, that has to be listed in here for the bidder. It's not invoked. That's the main thing I want everyone to know is anything beyond visual has to be in the contract.
So any other inspection criteria, MT, PT, any of that, it's got to be designated by the engineer. And it's got to be in the contract. They can't come back after the fact and say, yeah, we want MT here. Well, no, you guys didn't throw it in. This is what we've got. 6.1.2 is inspection and contract stipulations. So for the purpose of this code, fabrication, erection inspection and testing and verification inspection and testing shall be separate functions. That we're going to get into a couple of different contexts of what that means here in a couple of paragraphs. So 6.1.2.1 is contractor's inspection, which is different than verification inspection. Contractor's inspection. This type of inspection and test shall be performed as necessary prior to assembly, during welding, and after welding to ensure that materials and workmanship meet the requirements of the contract documents. Fabrication, erection, inspection, and testing shall be the responsibilities of the contractor unless otherwise provided in the contract documents. What'd that just tell us, Pete?
Well, basically, it's saying is the contractor's responsible for it. During fabrication, they have to make sure that whatever testing is invoked by the code and or contract or other specifications, that they have to meet it on an ongoing basis. That's basically the long and the short of that one.
Right, and it's like it says, the contractor, you need to be there during assembly, welding, and after welding to make sure that this thing meets the requirements of the contract document. So then we've got verification inspection.
What's another name for that, Gary?
What's that?
Verification inspection.
Third-party inspection?
Third party, that's right. Most people don't really know about it as the verification inspection. It's like, oh, that third party person. That's normally how I've always heard it referred to. Very rarely as verification inspection.
Right, and that's a big one. Like you say, third-party inspection is verification inspection. That's the one that gets thrown out. So our third-party or verification inspection is covered in 6122. This type of inspection and testing shall be performed and their results reported to the owner and contractor in a timely manner to avoid delays in the work. Verification, inspection, and testing are the prerogatives of the owner, who may perform this function or, when provided in the contract, waive independent verification or stipulate that both inspection and verification shall be performed by the contractor. So it depends on what you've got going on. Pete and I crossed paths and worked together down here in Houston. Then usually verification inspection is done by a third party so that the contractor can't say, yep, we got it done. Usually there's a third party that comes in and looks at it and says, yep, nope, nah, you guys need to go redo this.
Correct. And depending on the scope of the job and who the client is, some clients had more inspectors or less inspectors, or they do it as just certain hold points. There's many ways to have that function performed.
Okay, so then we've got definition 613, definition of inspector categories. So you've got the contractor's inspector, the verification inspector, and then you've just got inspectors. I'm not going to read through all three of these, but the contractor's inspector, that is the person that works for the contractor. That's the guy in your QA department that is making your life miserable by making you follow the drawings to the utmost or whatever. The verification inspector is the third-party inspector. He's going to come in from some outside organization, DNV or Fred's Barbecue and Inspection or whatever. They're going to come in, look at the drawings and say, yep, make sure everything's good. All the fillet welds look good. Everything is just fantastic. And then inspector, sometimes in 6133, you've got them both. They can both be one depending on what you're making, who you're making it for, and how you're making it. Thoughts, Pete?
Yeah, so as you said, the verification inspector is normally a third-party company. It could be an employee, though, of either the owner or the engineering firm. So it doesn't always have to be an independent company, but often it is. And you're right, the term inspector is just basically someone who goes in and inspects something. That there's no expanding on it when that's just a general word. So the next one we got there, Gary, is qualification of inspection personnel. And I think there's been a little bit of changes between the two codes here. On the 2020 version, it lists out, that it all has to be in the contract documents, which I think is, the verbiage has changed, but it's the same meaning is there. But going for the qualifications, and this is basically what the welding inspector of how they themselves are qualified. And there's 5 principal ways. The first one is to be an AWS CWI or senior CWI. Number 2 is be the Canadian version with a level 2 or level 3 welding inspector. The third is in conformance with AWS document called B 5.1, which is specification of welding inspectors. This is and one thing I left out on all of these. It's current or previous certification in these, and the B 5.1 is that can be an in-house certification. The two previously are done by a outside agency. Number three is an internal certification. Number four is current or previous qualification to AS&T TC1A level 2, and this is a qualification document for non-destructive testing personnel. And this also is a internal type certification. A lot of times you may hear someone talk about, hey, we got to update our written practice, or what does our written practice say about it? That's mainly driven by AS&T, S&T, TC1A. There are some other ones out there that also have written practices. CP 189 is a more stringent version of the S&T TC1A document. But like I said, those are all internal, or those two are internal. Number five is different than the other ones. An individual who by training, experience, or both in metal fabrications, inspecting, and testing is competent to perform inspection of the work. This is a kind of a big gray point on who is considering what competent or experienced. I have seen this fifth card played before, and depending on what you're dealing with will depend upon how much you need to back up that those to meet those requirements there. In all, having current certifications either by AWS or by the Canadian is really easy. No qualms there. The other two are internal. People may want to read your written practice to see what it contains to make sure that you can't just be a forklift driver on one day and then all of a sudden become an inspector the next. And number five, I would say you really need to have your ducks in a row if you're going to play that card.
Yeah, and see, when I worked for an outfit and we did some stuff out at the vitrification plant at the Hanford nuclear site, we were all an individual who by training or experience or both, they played that card. But it was a DOE site, so our level 3 gave us a visual inspection test, and you had to have a NDE resume. Okay, where had you worked? What qualifications had you had? Had you had VT certs before? Had you had MT certs? Have you had, a certain? I think they counted a lot of mine because I had a degree in welding engineering, so that gave me a bunch of hours, and then they gave me a level 2 test, and so they really had it backed up. And that's what Pete's talking about, is when, by training or individual, it wasn't them just pulling me off a forklift. It was like, no, okay, he's one of our welding engineers. He's going to have level 2 certs. Here's his qualifications. Okay, he's got a bachelor's degree in welding engineering. He's done this, and this. He's got this, and then he passed this test. So that's what Pete was talking about. If you're going to go that route, you got to have some paperwork. You can't just scribble it on the back of a bar napkin.
Correct. And contracts can also change this verbiage as well. As we've talked about many times before, the engineer can basically say you have to be current, and you have to be a oneer in meet the requirements of one or the requirements of two. They can change all this, or they could also throw in there's an alternate inspector qualification, like let's say the British version is called CSWIP, which is very comparable to the AWS CWI version, and so they could allow that in. So the alternative inspector qualifications could be another outside type inspector qualification program. They exist in China, they exist in Europe, so that's a whole other avenue. But if you want to have it, it really needs to be specified. The assistant inspector is very similar to the inspector for its qualifications. It has 5 versions. But what they allow, the first one is current or previous to the assistant welding inspector, the CAWI. That's how you can get in there. With number 2, current or previous for the Canadian level 1 inspector is allowed. Number 3 is an associate inspector according to AWS B 5.1. 4 is the same. It's a level 1 in AS&T TC1A. Or they also have in here CP 189, or as a level 1. And then number 5, an individual is specified by training experience to perform the function. So the way this would kind of change it is, let's take our example of our person that was on a forklift on Monday, and they're like, hey, we needed an assistant inspector. Hey, Mr. Forklift Driver, you're going to be promoted to be an assistant inspector. And you're going to work with our inspector to learn how to perform certain functions, and we'll train you up to do it. That would be a very logical progression from moving from like either welding or burning or some other operation into the inspection world without having any of these other certifications. That's more for how the progression of movement from one operation to the inspection world.
Right, and as an assistant inspector, you could, like you say, there's a number of different ways. If you had your program set up and said, all right, we're going to take forklift drivers, janitors, and welders, or whoever, and our program says, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. We're going to have them work 50 hours or 100 hours or whatever number of hours. They're going to have to take a class, and they're going to have to pass a test or a certain number of tests and whatnot. And then we'll give them their paperwork that says they're an inspector or whatever. But you should have it mapped out and definitely have some criteria involved and follow some kind of written program and have some testing involved in there. And the AS&T TC1A lays out for visual testing. That might be a good starting point. And there's some materials out there that you could find that, could help you put something together if that was the route you were going to go.
Exactly. Moving on to the next one is your eye examination. And basically, anyone doing any of the inspectors, assistant inspectors, anyone performing NDT, so that's if you're doing mag particle, dye penetrant, you're doing UT, RT, any of those folks, you need to have an eye exam. And you can do it either, like, you don't have to, if you don't wear glasses, well, you can take it. But if you do wear glasses, it's perfectly fine to take it with your glasses on. And you have to have it at least in one eye. I will be honest, I don't think I've met an inspector that only had one eye, but it does allow you to have one eye to meet the eye inspection examination. You have to have a Jaeger 2 at a distance of 12 inches, or an equivalent test is determined by an ophthalmic medical personnel. This is because there's other tests that may also work that would be acceptable for this. And you have to do it every 3 years or less. Most places I've ever dealt with required every year.
So that's you just go in there and you go to the eye doctor, get your glasses, whatever. I always have them sign mine off when I go get my glasses every other year or whatever the hell it is, and have them knock that out and get my CWI visual acuity, whatever the hell it is, dialed in and send that paperwork in. So it's the same thing.
Thanks for you reminded me. Is I just use that form that whenever you submit for your CWI, that's the one I just use over and over again. It's easily documented. Everyone's used to seeing it. I will say, just so everyone knows, that AS&T, and I believe, requires a Jaeger 1, or maybe it's ASME. So if you're going in there and you play in both worlds, have them do both.
So where are we going next? Verification authority on mine, 6145. The engineer shall have the authority to verify the qualification of inspectors. This gets back to, remember episodes ago we were talking about the engineer having the superpowers? Well, the engineer has the authority to verify the qualification of the inspectors. If she goes through there and looks at the inspectors and says, dude's a forklift driver. Dude's got no training. You have not submitted sufficient evidence that this person has a clue as to what they're looking at. They can kick it. Nope. this guy's not looking at our welds. You need to find somebody else. That's one of the authorities or superpowers of the engineer.
Correct. The 2020 version has changed a little more in placement, where it's more speaking about the terms of effectiveness, and inspector responsibilities are moved around, but it's basically the same.
Okay, so we got 615 inspector responsibility. The inspector shall ascertain that all fabrication and erection by welding is performed in conformance with the requirements of the contract documents. Basically, the inspector's job is to go in there and make sure everything was put together. It said to splash holy water on it and do a dance around the component before you bolt it together or whatever. By God, you better be doing that. So verbatim compliance. So it's the inspector's responsibility to make sure that that is done. It's not somebody else's. That's the inspector's job.
Correct.
And most inspectors that I have ever run across, they take this job very seriously, and like pit bulls almost or something. Very zealous in their approach to the job. So items to be furnished to the inspector. Okay, here's what you should, you got the third party inspector or your inspector, any inspector. The inspector shall be furnished complete detailed drawings showing the size, length, type, and location of all welds to be made. The inspector shall also be furnished the portion of the contract documents that describes materials and quality requirements for the products to be fabricated, erected, or both. You want to talk about this one, Pete?
Yeah, this is actually one that really gets kind of messed up a lot. And I always like to have a prefab meeting to make sure everyone was on the same page. Because sometimes I'd have an inspector trying to apply something out of the client's specification, and that's been superseded by other contract documents, other either exceptions or whatnot, and the inspector didn't know anything about it. It's like, hold on, you're supposed to paint this blue and you're painting it red. And it's like, well, that's because of this right over here, or there may have been a change in client spec may have said no flux processes are allowed, and we have an exception to that. And the inspector doesn't even know, so he's or she's kind of straggling around like, hold on, you're doing this wrong to the spec. But make sure that all the inspection folks have the most current of exceptions, specs, drawings, because that makes their life a lot easier, and in turn they won't be flagging things that are perfectly acceptable to the most current revision of whatever other document exists that allows you to make it 2 feet shorter than the drawing because someone mismeasured in the field and you need to make it 2 foot shorter. The drawings have been submitted for revision and they're on Rev 3 and you're on Rev 5. So that's real important for them to have everything. And as if you're the contractor as well, to make sure your own inspectors have it, and probably have a conversation with the third party or the client's inspector. Hey, do you have all this stuff? No, if you want to be the one providing it to them or making them get it from whoever's providing them, that's between you and that individual. How do you want to sort that out?
Right, and a lot of these, if you're a first-time listener and just getting into this, a lot of times you can go into these meetings and it can be pretty contentious or adversarial. Depends on who you're dealing with and where you've been, where you're coming from, what your previous arrangements or relationships are with some of the people in the room. But it's just part of the game. And, if you're a newbie inspector getting into this, just realize that a lot of times it's all not hugs and kisses and happiness in there, but sometimes it is. Just depends on what you're stepping into. So a little off in the weeds there, but
exactly, Gary. No, that's you're exactly right.
So 6.7 inspector notification. The inspector shall be notified in advance of the start of operations, subject to inspections and verifications. So this is just telling you can't tell the inspector, oh, it's all done, dude, come look at it. No, they want to see fit ups. They want to make sure the root goes in. There's a lot of different maybe hold points, checkpoints. So you need to notify the inspector beforehand. You can't just throw him a stack of stuff and say, oh, it's painted sitting on the truck. We're ready to go here. So
exactly. A lot of times, a lot of projects will have something that's called an ITP, inspection test plan, and it'll kind of walk through like notification requirements. Some of these are, if there's a full-time inspector present, they're probably quite a little bit more fluid because the person is there all the time, as opposed to someone who's only coming in at certain points of the project. They may require 2 weeks notification before the start of fabrication, and then a week here, or 5 days, or 3 days. And that's normally best to hammer all of that out in the prefab meeting, to where make sure everyone's on the same page. There's not missed inspections, depending on what kind of inspection it might be, or how things can get very painful, cutting things back apart, re-welding things. And that's this both does not create goodwill, drives up costs potentially unnecessarily. So make sure everyone's on the same page on that.
yeah, it's if you're a rookie and coming into this zone of the world, there's a lot of times that just things get ugly, and it doesn't take long to escalate in costs. And I've been on some stuff where it's just like things have just spiraled out of control pretty quickly, and it just gets ugly. Like Pete was saying, you need a plan and go from there, and generally a meeting to start things off. Inspection of materials and equipment, that's 6.2. Contractors, inspector shall ensure that only materials and equipment conforming to the requirements of this code shall be used. That's checking to make sure that they're not using some kind of, contraband, material that doesn't meet the code, the qualifications of, like I think, what is it, the Chinese steel J2 or something. Well, there's only three elemental restrictions on that. It's like you can't have this much carbon and this much phosphorus and this much sulfur. The rest is open. So it could be 316 stainless steel. It could be whatever. So and a lot of times, when I was working for an outfit, we'd read the WPS is submitted to us, and they try and substitute some of these Chinese steels. Well, this is the equivalent of A36. No, it's not. It's not A36. It could be, but it's not. So that's why you got to look at this and say, no, is this the equivalent, or that's what this is saying?
Correct. And what I would say is where it says the contractor's inspector shall ensure only the materials and equipment. So this is really pushing it on the contractor to make sure that you have the proper material on site. And what I would always suggest is you do a receiving inspection. That's how to help catch things before they become a big issue, or timeliness becomes a big issue. So if you're receiving a bunch of I-beams and stacks of angle, go out there, check heat numbers on it, make sure that matches up with the paperwork you received. Pull a tape measure on it. Hey, these beams are supposed to be 40 feet long, and they come in they're a 40-foot random, which could be common, and all of a sudden you got 39.6. Well, how are you going to deal with that? Is that going to require a splice that you didn't originally have on your drawings to make it fit up? Do you need to buy more material to make that? Do you need to send this back? But if you take care of it really early, it really helps to prevent a scramble right before you're supposed to lift some beams up in the air to make sure that they were the right thing, or feed them into your girder maker or beam line, or someone's welded a bunch of attachments to it, and since they all started measuring from one end, they didn't measure the whole thing, and a bunch of stuff's already welded on. So a receiving inspection really helps out on everything. A receiving and a shipping inspection, if you're shipping stuff from like your shop to a job site, it helps create a paper trail that you got what you were supposed to get in the proper forms, length, etc. And somehow someone didn't all of a sudden load up a stack of 2x2 by 3/16 angle instead of a stack of 2x2 by quarter. That's what I got to say about that, Gary.
Well, and this gets back to, I'm going to kind of go on a little side story here. I had a friend that was a millwright, and he was on a job in West Virginia, and I don't know what it was about, but anyways, he kept meticulous notes in a notebook. He kept notebook that was just crazy meticulous. So anyways, he goes back home to Boise, Idaho. This job had just been a grease fire. Anyways, so the lawyers get involved on both sides. Well, one of the lawyers called him and said, "Hey, can we take a look at your books? We heard you took really good notes," because he was like a foreman of the millwrights or whatever. And he's like, "No, I won't send them to you, but I will hand deliver them to your office in Washington, D.C. I want 2 round trip tickets from Boise to D.C. and then I want to stay for a week. Get me and my wife a hotel in, pretty close to the downtown area or whatever it is there with the walking mall. So they didn't have to rent a car to go see everything in D.C., right?" And so he drops the stuff off at their office, and they photocopy it. Lawsuit goes on. They give him back his notebooks. He flies back to Boise. But the moral of that story is, if you have it written down, you're going to win. I always have, if I'm out on a job as an inspector or a lot of times as an engineer, I write it down. I have a notebook of what I'm looking at, what job, what drawing numbers, all that kind of stuff. And with cell phones, take some pictures. Oh, here it is. Pull a tape on it. It's too short. You guys sent it to us too short. This is what we got going on. So, a lot of this is, if you're going to be doing the inspection, it's documentation, paperwork, and just bookkeeping. A lot of bookkeeping. And, these notebooks, any of those notebooks are admissible in court. And when I've been on jobs where things I knew they were getting uglier and uglier, I kept more and more. Not that I didn't take good notes, but they got much better if it was going into a fecal matter throwing contest zone of the universe. So
yeah, exactly. This is where a good part of where you use the assistant inspector, where you don't need let's say the full-time inspector or like a high-powered CWI kind of guy or gal pulling a tape measure on everything being received at the shop. Delegation of work, and have assistant inspectors monitoring mill numbers, coming in, pulling tape measures on stuff. That's a good division of labor and using right people at the right places.
And if you have somebody in your shop or whatever that does paperwork pretty well, whether they used to work in a medical office or somebody that is really good at paperwork, a lot of times having them track things for you too, that can be, like he says, division of labor. Inspection of WPSs is 6.3. So this is where Pete and I have played in this one a lot, where maybe you're going to have to dig through as a weld inspector, you're going to have to dig through the WPSs. 631 is pre-qualified WPSs. The contractors and inspectors shall ensure that all pre-qualified WPSs to be used for the work conform with the requirements as a clause 3, 5, and 9 and the contract documents. That's telling you, as an inspector, you got to dig through, before anybody strikes an arc, you got to dig through that pre-qualified WPS and make sure that it holds water. Comments, Pete?
Yeah, that's like I said, on some projects you get all these inspected ahead of time and approved by someone else. Other times it's the inspector when they're first showing up on the job site. For the contractor, I would really prefer to have all my paperwork signed off ahead of time, as opposed to the first day, I got 10 welders there ready to go. I got some fitters, I got some helpers, and there's something wrong with my paperwork. It might be right, might be wrong, could be the inspectors, the way they interpret something, but I have a clock where I'm burning a lot of cash because I got guys and gals standing around. So I would always try to have the inspection of the WPS done ahead of the time. That's what I really think is the important thing there. And you have to have them where they're available for folks. They're not even just the contractors, you need them available for the welder, and then your own in-house, the contractors QC as well, their inspection people.
I'm not going to go through WPS is qualified by test and then WPS is in production. Pete just covered all this. You got to have all that stuff there, and it has to be dug through. I worked for an outfit out of Kansas City, and I spent better part of 2 years in a cube digging through nothing but WPSs and PQRs and welder qualifications and heat treat procedures and whatnot. That's part of the inspection game there. And it's, once you kind of figure out how to review some of this stuff, it's not too bad. And they usually, side note here, if you are the person reviewing it, I always, when I would review them, I would, go through it and review it and then tell them, okay, you aren't in conformance with clause 3174. Fix this. Nope, you're not. You didn't address this. Fix this. And I'd type up a little letter, send it back through whatever document control channels there are, send it back to the party that generated the WPS or PQRs, and have them fix it, and you kind of play this game back and forth. And depending on who you work with, your relationships with them, it can be either really easy or, pretty onerous. Thoughts, Pete?
Yeah, that it can be a huge vacuum of time. Documents, you submit documents, they go into a black hole, they come back 2 months later. If you're the welding contractor on a project, and depending on how big it is, where you may be, I would really try to find out who the reviewer is. And sometimes what can be allowed to shortcut or at least speed up the system is providing a bootleg copy before the other submittal ever gets to them, because especially if it goes from if you're a sub of a sub of a sub, it may take a month to get to the owner's engineering company to review and then back. Well, if you can find out who that reviewer is, you email them a copy and say, hey, I'm going to submit this next couple days. What are your thoughts? And if they come back with some major issues, and maybe you can at least address those, so maybe the minor ones can be approved as noted. That's kind of my thoughts on that one there, Gary.
Yeah, and we discussed this, I think, in a previous episode or two. It's back channel stuff. If I'm dealing with, like, Pete and I have worked together, and I know he's reviewing my stuff. Okay, Pete, I'm going to send some stuff over. You want to take a look at it? What do you have heartburn with? All right, I'll fix that. No, I'm going to fight you tooth and nail on this, blah, 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 blah. And it kind of goes like that. It's kind of how the game is played for the most part. But I generally try to not use the submittal people when I'm communicating with whoever's reviewing. All the paperwork goes through that channel, but then I'm usually like, give me the phone number of the guy who's going to be reviewing this stuff and his email, so I can just send him this stuff and we'll have a conversation. And what usually would have been a very contentious, drawn out dogfight turns into, yeah, I'll fix that for you, dude. Is that all you want? All right, no problem. I'll just give you another WPS. I'll renumber it, blah, blah, blah. You good with that? All right, cool. And it saves a lot of issues. So
exactly. And as you send out, some folks are unfortunately keyboard warriors, and it's a Jekyll and Hyde from when they sit down and start typing an email versus in conversation. So it may be an easier thing to have. In person is best, second best is on the phone, third is by some kind of written communication. But I completely agree, Gary. What do we got next?
6.4, inspection of welder, welding operator, and tack welder qualifications. Determination of qualifications. The inspector shall allow welding to be performed only by welders, welding operators, and tack welders who are qualified in conformance with the requirements of Clause 4, or shall ensure that each welder, welding operator, or tack welder has previously demonstrated such qualification under other acceptable supervision and approved by the engineer in conformance with. So basically this is telling us you got to look at their paperwork and make sure they're able to deposit sound weld metal in there and they've got paperwork to back it up. If they've submitted welding procedures for flux core and then all of your welder qualifications are for shielded metal arc welding. Well, we've got a little bit of a disconnect here. So we've got to bridge that gap. Thoughts, Pete?
No, I completely agree that, and this is another one that if you can get these approved before fabrication ever starts, all the better. A lot of projects, I will say, now I've taken this same route though, is I'm 1,000 miles away, either approving someone's welders. I have no clue. It's a name on a piece of paper. What in that case, what I'll generally do is go through and say these are acceptables based upon confirmation of basically who's who, and that's going to be done on site. So if you say Bob's welding this stuff up and he's got a good paperwork, well, his ID card or whatever says Jill, we better have a good explanation on how that transpired. So that's the kind of my take on that, is try to get them approved ahead of time. If not, get them done in the very beginning in case there's any issues.
So then we got 642, retesting based on quality of work.
Well, this is a hot potato here.
Oh, yeah. Do I need to read through it, or do we just want to go into it?
I think let's just go into it.
All right. So my basic rundown of this is, if you've got a welder, and I've played this game in the past, I probably mentioned it in a previous story, but guy was he was kind of on the tail end of his career, and he wasn't doing the kind of work that he should have been. And I just went to his general foreman, and then kind of the bull general foreman of the job site. And I told them all, hey man, you need to get that guy working on something that's not code related. He can stay on the job, but if you want to keep him on what you got him working on, I'm going to make him retest. And we just don't want to go down that road. That's the inspector. You have that power. You've got to be able to demonstrate it. You can't be, the guy's got a little touch of undercut here. But if he's just putting in, like the pigeons hit the beach, just something absolutely atrocious, then you've got to have a leg to stand on. You can't just wield this hammer indiscriminately, but you're going to run across cases where it's like, good Lord, what's going on here? I got to get this guy to retest. This is not suitable for this application, and it's not quality. So I don't know. Go for it, Pete.
I agree. I've been on both sides of the fence on this one, where this is subpar work. You want to look at retraining. Do you want to maybe move them off, kind of like in your position where this would be more like, hey, take the individual off of doing vertical and overhead welds and put them on flat and horizontal, something that's a bit easier. But it can quickly blow up. Where I've been more on the when I was on the contractor side for this issue, it was, hey, this guy can't put a root in. And it was a fight for, no, I need this person, and this is the reason why it's okay. The one thing, though, it does really suggest is by using a simple test. And here, their example here is a fillet weld brake test. Okay, the advantage of a fillet weld brake test is you can do it in the shop. You can do it right then and there. You grab up 2 plates, weld them together, bend them over, and see how it's going. Not a lot of folks are going to fight that, because there's very little outlay. You're not sending something out to a lab. You're not having to pull heat numbers off of something or have mill traceable material. It can be a scrap bin test. And I really recommend trying to do that as your first swing at it. Then kind of what it calls about is a complete requalification, which depending on how good they are, or how perceived on how bad they are, will determine how big of a fight that's going to be.
Yeah, and this is got to kind of feel for the situation, and like you say, have some backup and documentation. And it's like, no, this is not good, and all right, I'm going to make him requalify because you guys are, or no, let's just do this simple test as Phil. All right, he's good, I'm satisfied, or. So there's some different ways to go at it. I would suggest diplomacy before you go in great guns a-blazing. So 643, retesting based on qualification expiration. The inspector shall require requalification of any welder, welding operator, or tack welder who has not used the process for which they are qualified for a period exceeding 6 months. That's pretty easy. If you haven't used stick welding, well, you got to requalify. No matter how good you are at it, you let it expire, we got to requalify you.
So just one quick thing on that with this whole COVID thing going on, Gary. Some of the major codes have all allowed that number to increase.
All right.
Yeah, that's something relatively new. So look at your ASME or AWS websites for whatever kind of field you're playing in, and see if your code's granted a longer extension there.
But in a non-COVID world, 6 months.
That's right.
All right. All right. Inspection of work and records. You know, 651, site length and location of welds. You got to make sure. Usually I just marked up drawings. How about you, Pete? I'd use a highlighter and red line them and put the date that I looked at them and mark them with a, paint pen on the part, okay, or.
Exactly. One thing, and this is also where the whole prefab meeting helps set the stage, followed up by periodic meetings throughout the job. And I mean, these could just be basically talking about the job over coffee or whatever in the morning, is scope of examination. So there's no, unless you have client documents or specifications that require something that's spelled out. Here it's just suitable intervals. This suitable could mean different things to different people. So I would have this as a talking point on what all parties kind of think of what a suitable thing is. Because unless you have herds of inspectors, you will not be able to watch every weld being made or every fit up at every portion of it. Are there projects that have an inspector at every station watching every fit up and every pass? It does exist. I've played in that world. It's not exactly fun all the times, but this is a talking point with everyone. Just make sure everyone's on the same page. And you're right, redlining drawings, Gary, as things are built or as things are completed, is exactly what I have dealt with before. And I think that's pretty much common. I'm not sure else how you'd really do it.
Yeah, get yourself a notebook and take some pictures and go from there. Scope of examinations, 652, inspector shall at suitable intervals their joint preparation, assembly, practice, welding techniques, performance of each welding operator to ensure that the applicable requirements of the code are met. So that's kind of what Pete was talking about. You're as an inspector, you're walking around. Make yourself seen. You shouldn't just be in a hidey hole somewhere and you show up one time. No, you should be out there looking at fit up, talking to the guys. Are these guys running up? Something's wrong. They're not running on spray. They're running that voltage a little low. Or why are you running the amperage on this welding procedure so high or so low? Or where's your preheat here? We're at 20 degrees out here in the middle of North Dakota. What do you got going on here? Where's the flame? I haven't seen a flame kiss a piece of metal in 2 days. You know what I mean?
Where's even the torch at?
Yeah. So these are things, as an inspector, I don't know. This podcast is kind of turning into a CWI crash course, I guess, but it is inspection. So
exactly. And one thing I want to point out that now this is 2020 and it's the same as in 2015, but perhaps in the future it may be different. But that it's either 653 or 853 extent of examination. And here's where it's talking about you got to look at everything. But what it talks about is it's the last sentence. Visual inspection for cracks and welds and base metals and other discontinuities shall be aided by a strong light, magnifiers, or other such devices as may be found helpful. So this is a big point of contention, and it's been part of my pain on the code committee for this is what is a strong light? A different folks can have different meanings of what a strong light is. Is that a battery? Is that the equivalent of a flashlight with almost dead batteries? Is that out in the sun? This is as of right now, there is no number associated with it, as you would find in some other codes that may have a certain lumens or lux requirement. Here is a strong light. So that may or may not change in the future, but that future would be 5 years away from now.
Yeah, and I guess to me that strong light, my interpretation is it isn't a little pin light or, you got to throw some light at this. Use your best judgment, I guess, would be my thing, but more is better. Act like a grown-up. Well,
Exactly.
Inspector identification of inspections performed. Inspectors shall identify with a distinguishing mark or other recording method all parts and joints that they have inspected or accepted. Any recording methods that have mutually been agreeable shall be used. Die stamping of cyclically loaded members without approval of the engineer shall be prohibited. This is just get it on a paint pen. All right. GP, okay. Gary Pace was here 12/22/1987. Okay. Or, just let them know that you've looked at it. Go ahead, Pete.
Oh, this is another thing that, especially when die stamping comes into it, some people want something a little more permanent. This is a good prefab item to talk about, is how are we going to do this? There are things that we may not think are cyclically loaded. The engineer actually knows they are cyclically loaded. So that's, like I said, it's a talking point. Prefab meetings are really good for covering that.
Like you said, and it also gets everybody, get in the room, prefab meeting. Hi, I'm da-da-da-da-da. I want this. This really bugs the hell out of me. Don't do this. Oh, we can do that. I'd prefer you did this. Kind of everybody throws their cards on the table. 655, maintenance of records. The inspector shall keep a record of qualifications of all welders, welding operators, and tack welders, all WPS qualifications, or other tests that are made, and such other information as may be required. Yep, as an inspector, you just became a clerk. Part of the game. Write things down, take pictures, measure things. I don't know. Thoughts, Pete?
No, definitely. Especially record everything that you inspect. The contractor's inspector, well, they got to look at all welds have to be visually inspected. A third-party person may have to inspect 10% of all welds made. So in that case, you would record what you actually looked at, not just what happened in the shop. So there's depending on which side of the line you are on, that maintenance of records could be a little different.
Yeah, and it just gets back to paperwork. It's a lot of paperwork and documentation and keeping track of it, having a file folder on your computer, downloading all the, writing up your little report on what you did, however, whatever documentation and how you're going to keep it. But I'm a big proponent of, having a notebook that I can take out in the field, taking some pictures of, with my cell phone, and then, having a set of drawings that I mark up, and then you can, kind of consolidate everything on a digital record, report writing there. But if you think you're getting into this inspection thing and you're not going to become a paperwork guru, I got to say, you're gonna have to you're gonna get a crash course in this and get into the paperwork pretty deep.
Yes.
All right, so that gets us out of part A. Now we're into part B, contractor responsibilities. 6.6, obligations of the contractor. You want to dive into this one, Pete?
Sure. So the first one is the contractor is responsible for visual inspection and the correction of all deficiencies, materials, and workmanship and requirements with this code. There could also be added specifications of whatever's done by the contract. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, Gary. What do you think?
Yeah, there's the contractor. You need to do this, and you need to fix it and make everything right, pretty much. They can't pawn it off. It says it right there. You shall do this.
Exactly. Inspector requests. So the contractor has to comply with requests of the inspector to correct deficiencies in the materials or workmanship as provided in the contract documents. Okay, this is not inspector request for coffee or for donuts or something like that, but this is if there's something wrong with the part and the inspector's like, hey, this is supposed to be 5 feet long and it's only 2. What happened to the other 3 feet? Well, that's you need to figure out how to comply with that unless there's something else that says that you don't. It goes back to making sure everyone's on the same page with documentation. This one could also be where we call it usually a weld pickup, where you build a girder or a part or whatever you're building, whatever widget, and normally the QC, the contractor's personnel, would go through it, mark it up, add a little more metal here, make this fillet weld bigger, grind this down, whatever. They would go through and mark it up. The craft would go through and fix any deficiencies. After that was done, sometimes they'd have the third-party person would go through it. What I always found a little better is have them go through it both at the same time. So as a welder's like, hold on, I just fixed that. Now you want me to fix this over here, or it eliminates that. They go through it once. Whether the QC goes through it and marks it up, and then the third party goes through and marks it up, and then it's all fixed, however it is. But this whole part of the thing is, if there's something wrong, the inspector flags that the contractor is supposed to fix it. Next one's a little different, engineering judgment. And this is where we have faulty welding, and you have, when you're removing it, you damage the base material. What do you got to do? So this is where this is where the contractor has to remove and replace the damaged base metal, or otherwise compensate for the deficiency in some manner approved by the engineer. So this also could be, let's say you're supposed to put everything in here with 1-inch thick plate, and somehow you put in some 7/8 plate in somewhere. You could cut it out and replace it. But let's say there's a whole lot of different attachments already welded to this where, hey, cutting this out would actually be magnitude more work and maybe even be more detrimental to the part than not cutting it out. Okay, but we have loads that exceed whatever a 7/8 plate can carry. And the engineer comes up with putting on some strong backs or what other bracing to take care of the deficiency. So you can leave the 7/8 plate, but you have to add on some I-beams over here, some C-channel over here, some angle there, or whatnot, to help account for it. So this is where the contractor, if they don't want to take it out and fix it per the original contract, there's another mechanism to walk them down that path.
Gets back to superpowers of the engineer. So they can do a lot of stuff, but you just got to get them involved and let them do their thing, and they'll give you an answer, yes, no, whatever, and you sort it out from there.
Correct. The next one is specified NDT other than visual. It's basically saying that if you have something specified in the contract other than visual, contractor's responsible to make sure it happens. Not much else to say about that one.
Yeah, because it gets back to the basic premise of this code that visual is the only thing that's required. Everything else gets tacked on in the contracts, or the engineer, or generally the engineer is going to include it in the contract documents and say, yeah, this, and this needs extra NDE. So just getting back to one of the basic premises of this code is that visual is the only thing that's required. Everything else is called out somewhere else and specified.
All right, the next one, Gary, is one that comes up every now and then, and a lot of folks don't know really how to handle it. Mainly, I'll be honest, it comes down to the money side of it, is non-specified NDT other than visual. So this is, you've bid a job to make some sort of widget, and visual inspection only, no other requirements. You're welding up widgets. You got piles of widgets made, and let's say it's got a full pen weld on it and 1/2-inch thick material on this widget, and the owner's like, hey, I want to do RT testing on this. And the contractor can either say, hey, it's going to cost you X, it has that, or allow it to be tested. So this could either be allowing access to the site or having them pick up the parts and take them somewhere else. And the owner's responsible for all those associated costs. So let's say for our RT example, there was spatter on the welds that were okay for visual. It didn't impede it. But now you got to put film right up against the back, and now you got to knock off all the BBs. Well, I guess depending on how bad it is and depending on the relationship, either some contractors will just do it. Other ones you could charge for it because that's preparation of the material. And the owner's on the hook for all of these additional costs. Whatever they agree to. Now, the exception to that is the last sentence, either like when you're attempting either defraud or gross negligence. So let's take that half-inch groove weld that was supposed to be a full pen, and you got some minor issues in it. Okay, you're going to be taking care of that on some cost agreed with the client. But let's say that half-inch weld is really only a partial pen where you just beveled both sides about 1/16 of an inch or so, and you just put a bead down on your side, and you're basically looking at like 7/16, 3/8 amount of weld or base metal that's not fused and looks beautiful on the outside, but there's nothing on the inside. That would be gross negligence, and that's done at the contractor's expense.
Yeah, that's a thing that can get ugly. I've heard all kinds of stories about slugging and, machinists going into a casting, machining into a casting, and they get down to a certain depth, and what they thought was solid metal is nothing but BBs, steel shot in there where it had been they'd poured BBs in there, gallons of BBs in there, and then just welded over the top of it. And so there are things like that, or slugging where people throw bolts or rebar or material in there so they don't have to weld out a 6-inch thick piece of material or a 3-inch weld or whatever. There's a lot of things that can go sideways out there and that's what Pete's talking about, defraud or gross nonconformance to this code. So Part C, this is where we could get into ugliness. No, this is going to be a grind. Part C, acceptance criteria. Scope. Acceptance criteria for visual and NDE inspection of statically and cyclically loaded non-tubular connections are described in Part C. The extent of the examination and the acceptance criteria shall be specified in the contract documents in the information furnished to the bidder. So this is telling you up front, okay, before we even get into this job, you're bidding it, you're going to need to do this, 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 and this. You can't come in after the fact and say, oh, this was supposed to be x-rayed and ultrasounded and all this, and the contractor's like, well, hell, I bid it just for visual. There's nothing about anything extra in here. So that's why they throw that in the scope. That's got to be up front.
Exactly. The next one is either 6.8 or 8.8, and this is engineer's approval of alternate acceptance criteria. So once we move into some of these other test methods, what we can start doing is having engineering critical assessments, or ECAs, where this is taking into account more than just your generic acceptance criteria in this code book. There you can look at actual MTRs, the actual strength of the materials, and say A36, well, it's 36 KSI yield. Well, but we really have 48 KSI material. Could we be allowed a larger defect because the material is not nearly as weak as we are thinking it is? And that would all go into this engineer's approval for alternate acceptance criteria. I haven't seen it done as often in D1.1. I've dealt with it in other worlds, in piping and pipelining and vessels, but where I have seen it applied in the D1 world is mainly it's an after the facts. How do we fix some deficiencies? So but that's all driven with the engineers heavily involved.
Once again, it gets back to the engineer's superpowers and their ability to, this code gives them a lot of leeway in what they can do and can't do. Okay, I've done the calculations. This heat number, this lot number, yep, it says it's A36, but it's really this. All right, here's my calculations. Nope, this is good. So that's
Yep.
what it's saying. And I guess I just regurgitated what the hell Pete just said. But 6.9, visual inspection. Pete, what do you got there?
It's pretty simple. It's one sentence. All welds visually inspected, and you have to meet the criteria in either table 6.1 in the 15 or 8.1 in the 2020, and table 10.15 for if there's tubulars, and I'm not sure which one that is.
9.16 for 2015.
All right, it's pretty self-explanatory. All welds have to be visually inspected. I think
Okay.
we'll cover these tables independently when we get there.
Yeah, we'll do like we always do and just have a hashing through of the tables. 6.10 is penetrant testing and mag particle testing. Welds that are subject to PT and MT in addition to visual inspection shall be evaluated on the basis of acceptance criteria for visual inspection. Why is that, Pete? Can you walk us through that?
Yes, and this might be another thing that may change in the future, but basically, the code allows mag and dye penetrant, and for acceptance, it's pushing you back to the table 8.1 for visual. And this is one of the reasons it's a point of contention with some folks is how do you interpret the results? So if you're using, we'll just use dye penetrant for example. Do you read the bleed? So if you have a little pinhole porosity that somewhere, some little indication that you missed visually, and this is exactly what these two processes are for, is to bring out things that may or may not seen by visual inspection. And all of a sudden that little discontinuity bleeds out all over the place. Well, do you read the bleed or do you wipe it off and look and maybe measure what the indication actually is? That the code is not exactly clear on this, and it may get revised in the future to clarify which do you do, read the bleed or wipe it off and measure what the actual indication is. What I would personally do, this is my opinion, I would use it to find things that are missed by visual and measure the actual size of the indication to the visual acceptance criteria, because otherwise things can get real big real fast when you're either reading the bleed or some kind of weird fuzzy outline when you're using a mag particle.
PT and MT, these processes they're basically a hopped up version of visual inspection. Like Pete said, you're just throwing some dye on there, throw some powder on it, bring out the dye that was trapped in the indication, and you make an interpretation on it. But an MT's the same thing, more or less, except you're using magnetic waves to and throwing some iron powder on there, and it's helping you find a discontinuity there and using magnetic fields to do it. But you're looking at it. You're not using a scope like ultrasonic testing. You're not looking at a piece of film. It's visual. It's just an aid to help you get to where you need to go. So I don't know if there was any value added on what I threw in there, but it's just kind of highlighting that these are both visual processes. 6.11, non-destructive testing, except as provided in 9.29 for tubulars, all NDE methods, including equipment requirements and qualifications, personnel qualifications, and operating methods shall be in conformance with Clause 6, inspection. Acceptance criteria shall be as described in this section. Welds subject to NDT shall have been found acceptable by visual inspection in conformance with 6.9. Anything to add there, Pete?
No, not really. It's a mouthful. It's basically telling us that this is how we do our business and which sections to go to.
The only one is, if we go down there a little further, the last sentence is acceptance criteria for ASTM A514, 517, A709, Grades HPS 100W steel shall be based on NDT performed not less than 48 hours after the completion of welds. Why do we got to let these ones cook, Pete?
Well, because these are really strong welds. These are our 100 KSI materials. I would not, even though this is listed as a absolute list, and it's written the same way in the 2020 version, I would apply the same thought process to any of our, even if you are applying this code to let's say listed base materials, it's our quenched and tempered, really high strength, 90, 95, 100, 120 KSI materials. I mean, you have a non-listed one that is commonly welded, where D1.1 is thrown at it, is 4130. All these we got to worry about is hydrogen cracking, could also sometimes called delayed cracking, that occurs after the fact. So if we just welded them up, let them cool down, we'll inspect them after lunch. Oh yeah, they're all good. Day later, 2 days later, they crack. Well, it's got a blessed weld. I mean, it could go out the door. So that's why we have a delay on these, is for hydrogen cracking on these high strength materials.
Yeah, and this is a phenomenon that manifests itself in these materials for the most part. You're not going to see this happen in 836 or some of the low carbon steels. This is for quenched and tempered materials. This is where this manifests itself, and where you're going to, obviously, this is where it happens because they wrote it into the code. This isn't just a Pete and Garry thing. Oh yeah, by the way, take a look at this. So radiographic testing, RT.
All right, so here's where our first dive into the first volumetric is radiographic testing, and we're going to go through these, but we're not going to go super in depth, otherwise, because I think these almost justify their own whole episode. So we're gonna go through them, but we're not going to go as the super deep dive as other items, just because they are so lengthy. But 8.12.1 or 6.12.1, this is our acceptance criteria for probably the majority of things that are made to this code. Statically loaded non-tubular connections. If you weld an angle, plate, all that stuff, it all goes underneath here. And this is basically, it gives us a figure for limitations of the weld size versus discontinuities. And we have several rules that we apply. Rules 1 is for elongated. They can't exceed a size, and there's figure 8.1. We have clearance issues. That's also, you can find in figure 8.1. Rounded discontinuities, you get another sizing in the 2020 version. It's S divided by 3 and not to exceed a 1/4 inch. And then we go on to number 4. This is where you start to have where a weld intersection of another weld or a free edge. You got to have there's other limitations you got to look through, and there's certain cases you got to apply to it as well. And you got isolated discontinuities or clusters of rounded indications. This deals on how you measure that. Number 6, we got the sum of individual discontinuities. This is where you got a lot of little things, and it gets all added up together. It can't be larger than a certain size. And we're like, this rule doesn't apply to 1, 2, and 3 above. And then 7 is, this is where like inline discontinuities, this is where you may have, let's say, a constant issue at the center line of the weld, or where flux is getting trapped, or maybe like kind of like a wagon tracks where you got it, or it's all isolated in one area, and it's down the length of the weld. All of this right here is our acceptance criteria. And if you're doing radiographic testing, you shouldn't be going to the code book for everything. You should have a procedure that has this information in it, but in a user-friendly format. Sometimes the code is not the best thing to read as a procedure. So This acceptance criteria a lot of time is cut and pasted, and perhaps more verbiage is added to it to assist the NDT tech in doing their job. Moving down to the next one is for cyclically loaded non-tubular connections. This a classical example of this is our either it could be a built-up or a rolled shape bridge girder. Well, maybe we don't have bridges in here, but something similar to this where we see cyclical movements. Wind towers are can sometimes be sometimes they're considered non-tubular just because their plate diameter is so large. Other ones, the client will say they're tubular, but anytime something moves a whole lot is where this would come into play. And this going through is similar to what we just did above. However, things start to become smaller, or they refer to other tables. Like the first one, instead of going to figure 8.1, it goes to figure 8.2. So they're making sure you're on the right table or figure is real important. Moving down to cyclically loaded non-tubular connections and compression. We had tensions first, we had compression next. The reason for the splitting up of the two is when you have things in tension, it is more likely for a crack to grow off of a existing indication. So usually have a tighter tolerance for your tension versus your compression, because it's hard for a crack to grow when you have a member in compression. As we see here, it's referencing figure 8.3 versus 8.2 for in tension.
Okay, so that takes us to ultrasonic testing.
I do believe.
That was impressive, Pete. You powered through that one. All right, that's a good stopping point for this episode. Pete and I will be back and take another deep dive into the material going forward here in Part C, and we'll see what happens then. Thanks for listening. Hope this podcast was worth listening to. We're going to have more content coming out. Also, if you want to shoot me an email, gpacex@gmail.com. Give me some ideas, or maybe there's some questions that you'd like me and Pete or me and Joel to answer in regards to welding codes, filler material, or any other material joining question that you might think we have a shot in hell of answering. Anyways, thanks for listening. Take care. Peace out.